Now that we're almost ready to go back home, some of the villagers want to come with us to see what life's like on the other side of the sea. To make the process easier though, we want to gather their data, such as their names, gender, and assign them numbers. We can't spare anyone to do the data entry for them though. How do we make them fill up our tables though with appropriate data? Well, we can use data validation. Yo! Hello! Welcome to another Excel lecture. Today I'm going to talk to you about a simple but powerful tool called data validation. So, what data validation basically allows you to do is put restrictions on what data a person is allowed to input on specific cells. Okay? So, by default, every cell in Excel has no data validation constraints. You can input anything. I can input letters, numbers, symbols, any combination of numbers, letters, and symbols, right? So that is a regular cell in Excel by default. Now, what data validation allows you to do is put in rules to only allow certain data types, data formats, data lengths, etc. into cells based on rules that you specify. Alright, so how do we do that? Say I'm coming up with a registration sheet for MEA, and I want to know people's name, age, date, time, the time they register, their mobile number, not their date, the date that they inputted this, their mobile number, what is this? The names of their guests they're bringing, names of guests, and their ID number. Okay, so first, what are rules of a valid name? Okay, a valid name is usually comprised of letters. That's it. But also some people have weird names and may have numbers, letters, symbols. I knew a guy in high school who had numbers in his name. So if you wanted, it's kind of hard to put constraints on a name. You can just allow any value for a name. Like this weird example of this guy who was named, mark my words, the third junior senior. So a conscious decision to make no data validation to allow any names with any value, with any length. Right? Now what's something that's very easy to put restrictions on? Your age. Now as you can see, this isn't a valid age. What is a valid age? 5. 8. Right? What is common about valid ages? They are numbers. They are positive numbers, and that's really it. So let's take a look at how we can come up with rules for age. Go to data, go to data validation, and there's 3 main tabs here we have to break down. First, what will you allow? So how data validation works is if your value is part of the allowed, so it's a Boolean value of true within whatever you specify, then it will be allowed to be permanently in the cell. If it is not, then it will be considered invalid, and we can go later on to what will happen if the data is invalid. But so options to allow, there's any value, a whole number, a decimal, a list, date, time, text length, and custom. And we'll go through all of these, don't worry. And there's a checkbox here for ignoring blank. Ignoring blank just basically means, do I allow cells to be left empty to be considered invalid, or get can they be left empty and without being classified as invalid. So if I check this, my cells can be left blank. If I uncheck this, then I will tell my users that they have to fill these cells, right? And then there's another tab here for data. Since it is a whole number, it allows me to specify as well further date the whole number between, not between, equal to, not equal to, greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, or less than or equal to. For me here, since this is like a college event, I am allowing all participants to have ages from 1 to 68, which is already a very generous margin. And that kind of classifies the rules. So whatever data I input, it takes the following approach. Is this data a whole number? Check. Is this data between 1 to 68? Check. If all of these are checked, then it's valid. If one of these are not checked, then the data is invalid, right? So next, what is input message? This can be enabled or disabled with this check mark. For this one, I have it enabled such that I can only see it when I select the cell F8. Here you can put instructions, messages about what kind of data you want to, or what to tell your users what data is allowed. For here, I'm very specific. Only positive ages from 1 to 68 are allowed. If you are of age greater than 68, please approach someone. You might have 69-year-old person or greater, and maybe you're just kind of ageist to them, but there's consideration, right? And this will pop up if you check this whether or not before you even input data. So it's supposed to prevent you from making a mistake because it kind of tells you what you have to do. This isn't even limited to regular instructions. You can put in message boxes for anything, even if you allow any values for your data. If I put any values, I can still create a message when I hover over it to tell me what I should do, or just be creative with any input message you would need. Like maybe clarify what this cell is supposed to do. That's still instructions, but etc. You can greet the person when they hover over a cell, if you're into that. Yeah. Next is error alert. Let's uncheck this for now. Error alert is very important. So what error alert does is when the user enters invalid data, a pop-up pops up, and there are 3 styles. There's a stop, there is a warning, and there is an information. Let's explore each. So I'll put a stop, and let's put some invalid data. Just a number and not between 1 to 68. It says halt, you must input an age 1 to 68, and if you saw a while ago, I actually physically typed that. Here's cancel and help. We don't really want help, so let's try cancel. So it deletes the data I put in and replaces it back to whatever was valid data before. Or if it was invalid, or there was no valid data before, it will just leave the cell empty. If I do invalid data again and click retry, it forces me to edit it, right? So under no circumstances, no matter how hard and how many times I butt my head against trying to put in a string of letters or a number greater than 68, it will not allow me to do so, at least in this cell. Next would be a warning. So let's try invalid data again. So we know cancel and help. What does no do? Okay, so basically like the retry and stuff, it forces me to edit the data. So I have to put in an age and treats it normally. If I try invalid data again and click yes, oh, it allowed me to leave invalid data here. But all it did was warn me that, hey, that's normally not allowed. But if you're sure that for some reason your registered age is, then sure, go for it. But you've been warned, you know. So say you wanted to put data validation actually in name to say only letters are allowed, then you can, but you can warn them and just say that, are you sure this name is not invalid? And if you click yes, then it will allow you to register your name under that. Otherwise though, you can edit it and click no, and you can change it to make it valid. Last would be information. So put in invalid data. It says halt, you must input an age from 1 to 68. If I click cancel, it brings me back to the old data. Well, for simplicity's sake, let's make it valid. And if I do it again, click OK, it leaves it there. So it doesn't automatically make me edit the data to make it valid, but it just tells me that, gives me information. It doesn't even have to be about why my data is invalid, but it just says something that you specify. In this case, I'm still telling my user what the constraints are and why this information message popped up. But in this case, if I click OK, it will allow me to leave it. So it's the equivalent of yes in warning. So just to recap, stop, under no circumstances will invalid data be allowed to remain on the cell. Warning allows you to choose whether to leave invalid data or not. And information will always allow you to leave invalid data, but will just tell you something, right? So information won't really stop you, but it will trigger a pop-up that will tell you something. And it's up to you on your own if you want to like edit this because you saw it was invalid or not. And of course, if I put valid data, none of those error messages will even pop up. So what's the use of like input messages, error messages? So as you saw a while ago, input message gives me information before I even put anything in. It's supposed to prevent me from even making the mistake in the first place. Error message, on the other hand, only tells me what I did wrong when I've done something wrong, or that is not within the parameters. And then I can choose whether or not to correct it depending on the error message chosen. Right? So it's more of just like, when do you tell someone that they validated the constraints? If they don't know, or like, usually age is pretty intuitive. You don't need to tell people what a valid age is. If they're honest, usually you just get like what? 18, 19, oh sorry, 18 or 19 or 20, right? So without even knowing all of these rules, I kind of know what a valid age is. So it would more likely for this scenario be better to use an error message only and like forgo the input message. But you can also do both. For example, in this, so I just put this here as a guide, but if I wanted, since I want to tell my users, hey, I want my data to be inputted in this format, follow this format. which will only appear when I hover over the cell. It pops up, right? Just because if I try 1, 15, 2020, classifies it as invalid. But okay, so this is a new type of constraint. It's a date. What were my constraints? The settings. Okay, I allow a date, so data type is date, but I allow it to be equal to the day. Now this is different from a while ago. A while ago I chose between values that I hard coded that I can still do here. I can do like 1, 1, 99, and I can do like 12. Sorry, 29, 12, 2020, right? And it will allow any value from 1999 to 2012. Let's say it's what date is it today? 24/11/2020, and it's valid. But exploring the other data options, I can do equals to, and I can hard code the date, or I can make it flexible and use functions like equals to day. So what this does is what it basically checks for is, first, is the data inputted a date? If so, is it equal to the date today? And my error alert here is a stop. So if my date is not today, even if it's valid, it will stop me until I put in the date today. Right? And I don't have to keep changing my data validation every day that way. That like, okay, date tomorrow has to be equal to 25/11/2020, etc. But because I use the today command, it becomes flexible. Oops, today. Next time. So here I also have instructions. Let's check. It's actually outdated. Yeah. Let's say I have a time here, and what would time restrictions look like? So time also allows me to choose between, not between, equal to, not equal to, greater than, less than, and all of these options. But say I want to allow any time that exists. So any time of the day. I can put a start time from 12 a.m. to 11:59 p.m. where of course the format is hours, minutes, seconds. Does my data have to be inputted that way too? Do I have to do 1 o'clock p.m.? I can, but also if I put in, like, say, military time 13:00, it does it for me. Or I can do 1 o'clock, and it just assumes AM. I can even do 1 o'clock PM, and it changes it for me, right? So for time itself, regardless of how you input time, it will adjust depending on your format here, which is something you can't control in your from your data validation standpoint, but could be important later on, and I'll show you why it's important. But just know that your input may change, but in terms of data validation, for this one, I think it's strict in how you specify your start time to be in this format, such that regardless of how you input it, well, of course, it's always going to be valid because I allow every time. But the same way that I can't do 1300 and then 12:59, oh, actually I can. So, although just to be, oh no, it adjusts it for you as well. but just for simplicity's sake, it's important to at least be clear from your standpoint how you're outlining your constraints. Although I could do 1300, this format allows me way more specificity. If I, for some reason, am just against 1 second of the day, I can do 12:01 second AM, right? So yes. Next, mobile number. So what are the constraints behind a valid mobile number? It's a number and it has a length of 11, right? So looking at these allowed values here, I have whole numbers, I have decimals, doesn't apply, list doesn't apply, date doesn't apply, time doesn't apply, text length applies, but I can't do both from just the, like, with the data options we've seen so far. Text length itself only says that I can have data between, not equal to, or equal to, basically length of something specified, but it doesn't tell me if this is a number or not. So instead, we make a custom formula, and the formula I used is equals and len of this cell is equal to 10. I know we said that the length of a number is 11 a while ago, but I'll explain later why, and that it is a number. So what this does is it takes the value. If this is a number, what does this function output if this is a number? It's true, right? And what does this value output if this is true? It's again true. And just combines both, that if both are true, then the entire function is true and it's a valid mobile number. Okay, now to reiterate a while ago the importance of formatting, why is it 10 and not 11? Well, just by trying to input, a valid mobile numbers are known with 57042670. By default, it deletes the 0. Just because Excel isn't that fond of like leading numbers with zeros, because normally it considers it insignificant. What you can do is, here in your format cells, you can specify custom formatting such that when you input numbers of, well, I don't know if you can count, but these are actually 10 hashtags. I want you to put a 0 at the start. Alright, and even though the 0 does appear here in terms of formatting, the actual data within the cell here, is actually 915 without the 0. So if I get the length of this, even though you can count 11, it will be 10. So just be mindful of these things that you might have to consider even though. So yeah. Last format we'll look at is list. Okay, go to data validation. What does a list look like? So a list, you don't have any more functions here to choose values between, greater than, equal to, etc. because it's a list. What a list just basically says is, if your value is within the list, it's true. If it is not within the list, it's false. Okay. Now there's an option here for in-cell dropdown or not. In-cell dropdown basically does is it allows you to, look here, drop down and choose from valid data. Now how do you put list items? Well, first you can specify via here. I can specify values 1, 2, 3 with a comma, separated, and with 1, 2, 3, and these will appear here in the drop down, or I can like a while ago, choose from an existing column. I do equals dataset names here. Then, assuming all of these are unique, I can drop down and choose from here. Now what if I remove the check for in-cell dropdown? I can't see exactly what data is valid anymore, but if, for example, my guest is registered, and you should obviously know the name of your guest, say Anne Steele, then if you put it here, it's valid. It doesn't show any more drop down or whatever. But if I wanted to like put in someone who isn't on the list, say Joe Mama, then it says it's not valid, right? So that's a list. Lastly, just to challenge you, how would you make data validation for an ID number? And it's up to you whether you want to decide like this is ID numbers within MEA or a regular Ateneo ID number. I'd say the first one is easier than the second, but I'll give you a second to think about it before I give you an answer. Alright, so if you want to be specific about, I want to find valid data numbers, ID numbers within MEA, usually MEA would have a list of valid data ID numbers collected upon registration. So for example, I have this list here, 188, 155. For some reason we only have 5 members, we've gone downhill. Can use data validation, list, source, this. You don't even have to use in-cell dropdown because you should know your own ID number, and as long as you've registered validly as a member, then when you input your ID number, it should be treated as valid. Another thing, so what if I just want to know the ID number of people, I just want to know if you have a valid Ateneo ID number. How would I do that? What are the rules of a valid ID number? First, it's a number. Second, it usually has a length of 6. What else? If you want to be more specific, the first 2 letters are usually a valid school year, right? So for my year, our ID numbers start with like 18 or like 182 something something something, 19 something something something. So ID numbers such as 21, 22, or 23 don't exist yet. So I can make a custom function that analyzes all of these things to be true with an and if all of these are true, then it's a valid ID number, right? Technically, you can even create a constraint with just these 2 rules, but it won't be as specific, right? Your goal with data validation is to be as specific as possible with what data you will allow. So, limit rules. So yeah, data validation just doesn't have to be mostly just for restricting values, though that is its main purpose. You can use it to convey information, like a while ago, with your input and error cells, and generally it makes having to think about and sift through different data formats, having to work with invalid data, less of a hassle later on. And you can imagine this would be harder when you have rows and rows and rows of data to work with. So having your data ready and valid before you even look at it is a very useful tool to learn. So I hope you guys learned a lot and are able to make use of this. Thank you. Wow, we got all the data we needed and so many fresh new faces. Good job on surviving the day. We're almost ready to sail away again finally. We have everyone and everything we need, but we still need to start organizing a crew and planning our voyage. See you in the next synchronous session.